Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here with Philippe J. Fournier for this special summer mailbag episode. Philippe, it is early July when we're recording this, mid-July when it's going. I hope the summer has been good for you. What are you looking for during this summer? Are you hoping to take some time off? What are you going to do?
Oh, I'm looking for time off. It's just that for the people who know me, they know that I'm not sick or anything, but I am a workaholic, and it's really hard for me to disconnect and let go. I read way too much news, and at some point it weighs on me. I want to stop, but I can't, and then I find myself bored out of my mind on vacation. But I have to discipline myself to really take vacation and disconnect because it would just be too easy to just scroll social media and read more news and more news and more news and yeah. So it's a discipline. But you're shaking your head right now. But
Oh, I love disconnecting. I love
yeah.
the
Well,
excuse to not pay attention to the news.
I love it too. It's just that it's hard for me to do because I fear of missing out. FOMO, right?
Yeah.
But what about you? You'll just not read the news for a few days and weeks.
Yeah, that's it. But the thing is, I'll probably absorb the news casually, like a normal person does, and feel what it's like to just see what hits you, what doesn't. You go a full day without hearing or reading a single news item. A lot of Canadians do that every day. Probably not our audience, probably not the people
No,
listening or watching right now,
no.
and that's why we love you. So, because this is a little bit of a delayed episode, we didn't want to talk about anything that could become, out of date pretty quickly. So we asked our Patreon members for some questions that are a little bit more broader, taking a little bit step back from the day-to-day, the week-to-week of politics. Some personal questions a little bit, some about our model, about polling, and about politics in Canada. So why don't we dive right in?
All right.
And for that, why don't you take the first one?
Okay, so Bob on the Patreon asks, is there any seasonality to polling numbers? Which I think is an interesting question. Is a government better off calling an election in the summer, where people are generally more upbeat, than in the winter, when people tend to be more depressed? Well, I'm not sure how exactly true that is, but okay. If
Depends
people feel,
on what your views are on snow and
and the
winter,
cold,
I suppose.
yeah. If people feel patriotic and happy about Canada after Canada Day, could a government leverage that? Well, okay. I'll just start this by saying a summer election is, I think, always a bad idea. People do not
I
want to
don't think
follow
people
a
appreciate
campaign.
it.
But if your point is to reduce turnout, because we know some parties have done this in the past, a summer election would be great. But I don't think summer. Yeah. So what do you think, Eric? Where do you stand on this?
Well, when I saw this question, I remembered that I'd written something about it a few years ago. Because as part of my every election project, where I'm trying to do little historical capsules of every election, I have a whole record of all the dates of all the elections. So I was able to kind of go through the numbers pretty easily.
Oh,
And I found that there was disproportionately fewer defeats in June, in May. So in the spring, you had a lot of elections, but not as many governments being defeated. And you had more defeats in July, August, and September. Not a lot of elections held that time, but the ones that were held, there was more defeats than there should have been. If the timing of an election didn't matter, you would expect that there should be kind of, if there's 20% of elections in September, you'd have 20% of defeats, that kind of thing.
yeah.
But no, you have that governments disproportionately are reelected in the fall and the winter and disproportionately defeated in the summer. So it's kind of counterintuitive. It's not what you would expect in terms of people feeling happier and all this, but maybe it is just what you said, that people aren't really happy. They have to have an election in the summer. And maybe it's also a sign that governments, if they have to hold an election in the summer, it's because their time is running out and
trouble.
things are going well for them. So that's it. So it's actually better to have your election in the fall or the winter. The summer can be tough for an incumbent government.
People are generally more upbeat in the summer. Well, yeah, but because they're on vacation or because more people take vacation, not upbeat to follow politics and campaigns all the time. And I know journalists would be pissed to have to follow leaders and yeah, no. I also say elections in the winter, please no. Like in the
Not too
the-
late, no.
Yeah, there was an
Fall,
election,
nice.
the '08 election in Quebec. It was in early December, and it just
yeah.
turns out that it was a huge snowstorm. I think it was the day before, and it took out like Quebec City and down the St. Lawrence. And I mean, a really big one. And the turnout was significantly lower. And they didn't move the election. It was too late, right? It was not the government's fault. It's just riskier. So don't do that, please.
Fall is the best time for an election, and that's why most of them are. Like, that's why our calendar is going to be so full in October. We've got 3 elections. So some of the questions we got are actually from previous weeks. I recorded some and kept them on in our little document so that we could save them for the summer. So some of these, if you're listening and you hear your name, it's because you might have asked this months ago, and I saved it. So this is the case with Avi Woodward-Kellen. Liberal Party has been referred to as the natural governing party of Canada and has often been teased adopting whatever the current zeitgeist is. How has that changed since its founding? What are the areas of greatest continuity or discontinuity? So are the Liberals still the natural governing party today?
Thing is, I wouldn't think so. I mean, it depends. We'll see what happens to the party post-Trudeau. Because the Liberals, historically, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're the historian among us here, they have been able to lean right and lean left and be this broad, consensus-based, big tent party and near the center, which usually is really hard to dislodge if you're that party. Whereas the Conservatives, historically, I think have done well after long periods of Liberal rule. So... But today, I mean, the West is getting more populist, and of course we know that outside of the urban cores, the West is more conservative than the average Canadian. That balance is changing. But is there a natural governing party right now? We don't know. I mean, we're about, we're 24 years into this new century. We're 21 years in the post-merger of the Conservatives. I think our sample size is too small. So if Poilievre becomes prime minister and he's a one-term prime minister and the Liberals take another decade, maybe we'll change our minds. But right now, I don't think so. What do you think, Eric?
Well, I think the question, mentioned continuity or discontinuity. One of the things that's been the bedrock for the Liberals and why they've been that natural governing party for as long as they were, was that they did have a very strong hold on Quebec. Right, so that was always their base, and whenever they formed government, it was often I can't even think of an election where it didn't happen, where they had a lot of the seats, if not the majority of the seats in Quebec, and then they were able to add to that seats in Atlantic Canada. Harder to believe, but 100 years ago, lots of seats in the West. They would dominate Saskatchewan, Alberta, and then Ontario for a long time was kind of PC leaning, but the Liberals would be able to win enough of Ontario to form a government. And often when you look at the maps of Liberal governments, it's a pretty solid block in Quebec and also pretty red Ontario with some smattering of other seats elsewhere. So the question is whether that still holds as much. We haven't had that many elections with a united Conservative Party and the Bloc Québécois, both existing at the same time. During the 90s and the 2000 election, the division of the right in the West, I think, gave the Liberals a little bit more kind of wiggle room. But now with the Bloc seemingly not going away after 2011, 2015, they've kind of rebounded. And the Conservatives having that block of seats in Western Canada, I think we might be more in a alternating mode rather than the Liberals governing, 2 out of every 3 years. I think that we might go to a more 10 years one way, 10 years the other way, if the Liberals hold together. I'm not going to proclaim the death of the Liberal Party, but they would be at some risk that their coalition kind of can fall apart and get replaced by the NDP. But I think we're more in a back and forth rather than a Liberal dominance. If I had to guess what the patterns will be for the next 100 years, it would be that. Don't hold me to it.
We will. I mean, right now, if the NDP had a very popular and charismatic leader, the Liberals would be in so much trouble. Mm-hmm. But the NDP doesn't, and so we carry on.
Okay. This one I thought was actually really funny. Why don't you read it?
Anthony Kudo on the Discord asked, which election loser, so the party that finished second, do you think would have won in a different election, either before or after, or a different level of government? example, would Scheer have won in 2021? Well,
why don't we go back? Why don't we go back and assess them? Right. I think Aaron O'Toole could have won in 2019. I think that would have been a much better election for him.
Yeah.
Because Scheer, out of Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole, I think O'Toole was by far the better campaigner and had fewer kind of vulnerabilities that were problematic. If there wasn't the pandemic to try to kind of make the Conservatives look a little bit extreme, and there wasn't the stuff about, the weirdness with whether he was an insurance broker, that he was an American citizen, and then the stuff about abortion during the debates, I can imagine that Aaron O'Toole could have won in 2019 when things are going pretty badly for the Liberals.
Yeah, after the Saint-Lavalin, they had some pretty bad polling numbers during that late spring and summer. Andrew Scheer did have a lead. I don't want to say something stupid here. Entering the election, I think both parties were pretty much tied.
Yeah.
But the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois was still down in Quebec, and there were some polls. I remember a Léger poll that had the Conservatives first in Quebec, and it was obviously a protest vote. But that TVA debate, man, that for those who don't remember, I mean, when you talk about a debate takedown, the classic example is always 1984 Turner and Mulroney, right? But that's because English Canadians did not watch that TVA debate, where Andrew Scheer, 5 minutes in the debate, was completely cornered on abortion, and his French, although Monsieur Scheer seems to be speaking French very well, but he speaks well off a prompter. In the debate, he just completely missed his words, and he was cornered on abortion, and it was over for the Conservatives in Quebec, and that helped the Bloc revival. I know there's a lot of stuff that happened between 2015 and today, but if you take 2015 Mulcair and travel in time and replace Jagmeet Singh Will Mulcair right now, the NDP would be really, really attacking the Liberals, and I think the Liberals would be in far more trouble. But I don't know. I mean, it's hard to answer because
Jack Layton, I think, and if he had not passed away, I think he probably could have won the 2015 election.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's possible. I mean, we don't know how those 4 years of Conservative majority governments would have weighed on him. We know that his health was already bad during the 2011 the election. That's one. Is there an election? Okay, I'll say this. Stéphane Dion would have probably won the 2000 election, because the 2000 election was such an easy one for the Liberals.
Yeah,
I mean, you could have put anybody in there. The 2000. I mean, against Stockwell Day in his ski suit, and the Bloc not doing so well, and the NDP crumbling. This, I think, anybody for the Liberals almost would have won the 2000 election. But this
what
is
about
a
Michael
fun
Ignatieff?
exercise.
Is there an election that Michael Ignatieff could have won?
Oh God.
Imagine. I think that's a no.
Imagine replacing Stéphane Dion and doing worse. Stéphane Dion. I mean, I don't want to speak against the guy. I'm still speaking about his leadership career. I mean, he has a lot of qualities, and I know he's a very smart guy. I know a lot of people in Quebec don't like him for many reasons, and I understand why. It's just that he was not made to be leader. He was made to be in the team, but not leader. Yeah.
You know what?
Yeah.
I think the Liberals would take the 2008 results right now.
How many seats did they win? Like 75?
They won 70-something seats. Yeah. They got like 26, 27% of the vote. That looks like a good result right now for the Liberals.
You're right. You're right.
I don't know. Also, Preston Manning back in the 90s. Maybe he should have ran. He should have tried to run. I could see him leading the UCP right now. In the current context, he could be the premier of Alberta.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we have to. I mean, I didn't have that much time to prepare for this question, because I'd like to have a full map. And I mean, could Mario Dumont have won an election in Quebec? I mean, there were talks.
He almost did.
He almost did. Although, I mean, he almost did, but his party was revealed as a complete empty shell in the months after, and Jean Charest we won. So very good question, but we'll get back to that, I'm sure. If I think of another thing, we'll get back to that in future podcast. So.
Okay, we had some questions related to polling methodology and our projection models, so I thought we could group them together. This was one from Pragmatwit that we got on Discord. When doing modeling and projections, how much of it is a secret sauce versus established knowledge tips from the trade? How much of it is it? There is an element of secret sauce because we all have to make choices as to what we weight, what we exclude, what factors you decide to take into account, which ones you feel like you don't need. So like, there's the basic kind of thing that you swing the numbers around based on the polls. Yeah. But after that, there is an element of secret sauce there in terms of your own judgment, in terms of what you're going to put into a model.
The secret sauce for me is not that secret because I've spoken about it many times. It's a small factor, but there is a small element of the demographic data per riding. And the reason I added that when the first iteration of my model was for the 2018 Quebec election, as I was testing the model, I tested it between the 2012 election in Quebec and the 2014 election in Quebec, according to the polls that were available then. And then I realized that if you add the age curves per riding, which almost every riding has the similar age curve, but there are exceptions. You find out that, okay, so it can swing a little more to the Liberals or a little more to the CEQ or whatever. So there was a little bit of that, but it's still minor. I think you and I, Eric, have a similar belief that a model should be simple enough. If the more factors, the more variables you enter in, the more you can over model and think you're smarter than actually the model gives you access to. So that's, I would say, my secret sauce, but it's not very secret. What about you?
Well, once in a while you also have to have something to take into account special cases, right?
Oh, yeah.
If you do something like I'm not sure. Like if an MP has been there for one term versus 2 terms versus 3 terms, you give them different things. You might start to overfit because you're not really talking about a lot of people and a lot of kind of cases to base it on. But then when you have like a leader in a new riding, when you have a star candidate, when you have someone who is running as an independent, when you have someone who's doing as a floor crosser, you sometimes need to have something to take into that account, and you don't have a lot of cases to base that on, right? So if you're looking at the impact of a floor crosser, you might only have at best a couple dozen, if that, and some of them might be dated from a long time ago, and then they change ridings or the boundaries change. Like there's so many exceptions that at some point you do just need to be like, I'm going to have to use this 8 case sample to make a calculation because what else are you going to do? So you do need to sometimes make that judgment call of when enough is enough to have an adjustment for a riding and when to leave it alone. And also that the star candidate thing, that is completely subjective. You have to kind of come up with whether you decide someone is a star candidate or not. And sometimes there's star candidates you don't know that are actually star candidates, and sometimes there are star candidates that turn out to be duds. So there's no way of knowing that.
If I can about the variable for a star candidate or local effects during a campaign, I talk to representatives of parties, and I will not take their word as gospel about them. But I will listen to them if they say, oh, well, let's say the Conservatives tell me, oh, yeah, this Liberal candidate, he's stronger than we expected, that this may mean something. Maybe they're playing me, but so far it's been pretty good. I mean, when we have, during an example for the Quebec campaign, when I asked the CEQ, what about this riding? What about this riding? And they were confident almost everywhere. Oh, yeah, we have a good team. We have good numbers. And then you ask, what about this riding? And they go like, well, this one is going to be tougher. It's like, oh, okay. But again, thank you for that word. It's not over model, it's overfit. Overfitting is a problem. Keep it simple, and remember that the goal here is not to hit the pins to be on the green. I think I used that expression. We have so many local variables that you cannot know during an election. So just I'm happy to be close enough. I'm very happy if I'm right on it. It's just that I know there's some luck factor in there.
That's it. That's it. Right. Anybody who is over boasting that they got very close on a poll, or they're once you get close enough, then it's just luck. Then there's no way that you can guess every riding correctly. This one I'll ask you, because for me the answer is a quick no, but I'm not sure if it is for you. So NK on the Discord, is national mood something that's included in your model? Say a riding is tied within the margin of error between the Liberals and Conservatives. If the Tories are sweeping nearly the rest of the country, is that enough to give them a leg up in who's favored? Perhaps considering correlation between ridings, or is it baked into the vote estimate already? Do you have any sort of momentum or bonus based on how a party is doing more broadly?
Well, the answer in the calculation is no. But the answer in, let's say we get to the night before the election and we get the final numbers, there is a correlation between ridings. This is really important. Like, again, if you look at the results of St. Paul's, it's easy for us to say, well, if the Liberals lose St. Paul's, they could probably lose 10 to 12 other seats in Toronto. These are not independent events. But the national mood, I will take into account in my analysis when I go on media and says, well, if the Liberals, gain 2 or 3 points, it sets a ceiling and a floor, right? It will be very hard for the Liberals to get back to 30%, for instance. I think a score they would need to have to reduce the Conservatives to a minority if the national mood is just down the toilet. So in the calculation, the answer is no, but it's something that I will consider going forward in my analysis.
That's really a good point, because there's the baseline of what the model produces, and then how you choose to interpret it, right? Yeah. So, if there's a party that seems to be on the decline, that they don't seem to have good turnout numbers in terms of their support among ages, and if the projection was that they'd win between 80 and 120 seats, with 100 being in the middle, my analysis would probably say that they're more likely to end up in the 80 to 100. Even if the model doesn't necessarily say that, my own judgment would then come into how I would present the numbers to people. And I think that's the extra little bit that again, is a bit of the secret sauce, that you have to have some experience in seeing how these things unfold to have an understanding of how your own model is going to be wrong, or how it's going to, or what are the intangibles that are actually more likely than what the calculations show. Donovan Ekstrom, who's a prolific questioner, how does phone polling work? And does the decimation of landlines by cell phones and a general distrust of random phone numbers make it as reliable? He says, I'd imagine phone polling would be right up there for reliability, but trying to get a hold of people these days is a nightmare. What have you heard from pollsters these days about what it's like to call people? Okay,
so they do call cell phones. We know that. I know it's a common comment on social media. What is that, a phone line with all old people? No, they call cell phones. A poll done by phone is still the most, I think, reliable method. Mm-hmm. It's just that if it's done well, so much. If it's done well, of course. I always preface if it's done well. It's just that it costs so much because you have to call so many people. But it was already the case in the 80s and 90s. When the response rates were low back then, it was 5 to 10%. So if you want to have 1,000 cases, maybe you have to call 25,000 numbers. So I don't see it as less reliable. The reason we see fewer of them is because of the cost. IVRs cut the cost down, but IVRs are also limited in what they can do. You cannot show a picture. You cannot ask a very long-winded question. You cannot. It has to be short questions and with short answers with IVRs. I like IVR because of the cost, but it's limited in what it can do. But please, people, stop saying, it's all landlines. No, it's not landlines. It's also cell phones. Cell phones. If you answer a poll on a cell phone, that company will keep that number and say, okay, this person answered. Maybe we'll call him back one day. You're still anonymous, but that number will be entered as okay, this is maybe a likely respondent.
And the cost goes up as the response rate goes down, right? Yeah. Because if you need to call more people to reach the same amount of people, it increases the cost. So I don't, as you said, I don't think it really has an impact on the reliability in that sense. Obviously, if the response rates were 20 and 30% as they were like back in the 70s or whatever, then that would be better. But they can still get 5 to 10%, 15% sometimes with phone polls. IVR is a lot lower. It's usually more in the 1, 2, 3%. The lower you get, though, on the response rate, it does start to raise the questions of who are these people, and are they different? If 1 in 10 people will answer a poll, are those 1 in 10 different than the 9 in 10 who aren't answering the poll? It's still reliable, but as you said, we don't get a lot of them. The only one that's doing political polling with phone nationally that we see is from Nanos. All the other ones are doing online or IVR.
Janet Brown
some of the regional
in Alberta,
Well, some of the regional ones do, like Janet Brown in Alberta does phones, Narrative does phones out in Atlantic Canada. But that's also one of the reasons why their samples are so small. It would cost a lot of money to have a bigger sample. Mark on the Discord. This is an older question he had asked, but he said, can you get into why where a poll has really questionable numbers in one or more regional subsamples, we can still generally trust the top line numbers rather than tainting the overall result? That's a good question, because we often talk about how this region number looks weird, this demographic number might look odd, but we don't usually doubt the top lines that much. So how would you answer this?
Okay, so this is the basic of the science of statistics, that your subsamples will have errors that are implicit, that are included in them, but chances are the errors will mostly cancel out if you have a big enough sample. The odds that you have, let's say, 6 regional subsamples and all of them overestimate the Liberals, the odds are really low. And that's what the 19 out of 20 means, that your regional subsamples will fluctuate more, but when you add them up, and that's why we add up all the Atlantic provinces, that's why we add up Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and I know people dislike that, but it's if you have Manitoba alone, you'll have 60 cases and numbers will be useless. And if you double that with Saskatchewan, and you have a string of them, you can see a progression through the fluctuations. So the subsamples all are prone to higher error, but the odds that all the error goes on the same side is very low. So that's why the top line numbers are generally reliable.
There's also the other factor that, first of all, there's just the margin of error, theoretical or otherwise, whether we're talking about online or not, that would move numbers around anyway. But also that if we're talking about Atlantic Canada, for example, and let's say a party is overestimated by 10 points over the average, nationally that's going to add up to about a point.
Yeah.
Maybe even a little bit less than a point. Even in Ontario, if a party is 10 points higher, it's still just a little bit less than 4 points nationally. So that's also one of the things, right? If we do see that, the Liberals, like we've seen in some polling that was done in June, were a little bit higher in Atlantic Canada, if it's not actually happening, it might mean they're only a point below, lower than they actually are at the national level. So it usually doesn't matter that much.
Yeah.
And as you said, if one region is high, usually another region will end up just being low just because of how it works out. So it ends up canceling each other out. But it usually doesn't matter that much on the national sample. If we were looking, though, at like a tied race, when the polls are one party's 15, 20 points ahead, it doesn't really matter that much. When they're tied, then that's maybe when you have to take a look at the demographics just a little bit more closely.
Okay, I'll get this one. A on the Patreon ask, how is Canadian polling culture different from what goes on in the USA? I mean, I've on the record in the media saying that Canadian pollsters, well, the good ones at least, are generally better than the American pollsters, the good ones at least. There's some information that is hidden in there. It is harder to poll Americans for many reasons. There are more Americans in proportions that are anti-system than there are Canadians. That's one thing, and the odds that they will answer polls is lower. But more importantly, when you poll Americans, usually those polls are really long, and they ask questions about the Senate, about the House of Representatives, about questions that will be on the ballot, like referendum questions that will be on the ballot, about the presidential race. Have you seen an American ballot? It's really long.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we whine about the longest ballot we just had in St. Paul's, but many American ballots look like that, and they have to answer different questions and punch different holes or make a check sign. Whereas in Canada, they ask you, okay, there's 5 parties, which one would you vote for? That's it. So it's easier to poll Canadians, and it's easier to poll our system here, I think. What do you think?
There's a couple other things to add. The waiting in the United States is usually done a little bit different because they'll wait for a race, which we generally don't do here, as far as I know. They'll sometimes wait for party ID to try to make it align with registrations in a particular area. They have to poll registered voters versus just all adults, because whether you're registered or not is more important in the United States. And also, just in terms of the relationships, there are a lot more media pollster relationships.
Yeah.
Often with universities, and a lot more phone polling than we see here because there's money that's put behind it. IVR is far tougher in the States because I think in a lot of states you're not allowed to do that kind of polling by IVR. So that changes things as well. So there's lots of little ways in which like the industry is different. And also, like I said, there's a lot of more pollsters, a lot more money sloshing around there that media can dish out. So you get some more interest. You get exit polling on election day. We sometimes feel kind of small and parochial when I think about our polling industry versus the United States. So anyway, it's one of the things that they do. I wouldn't say better, but they have lots more of it than we do. Can you imagine how much like we haven't had a poll in Saskatchewan now for a couple of months. We haven't had one in New Brunswick. Do you know if they had a special election happening in Alabama or something like that, we'd be deluged with polls, and we have to beg for them.
Absolutely.
Anyway. All right, we got a couple last questions here.
Let me
we got another one from Donovan.
Donovan asks, what is your beverage of choice during election night? I have a few answers. What about you, Eric?
I usually enjoy a cider. That's usually my drink. I'm not big on beer, so I don't often have that. And also, I don't want to drink anything too hard during a live stream. That could be bad. So that's usually my go-to. And I like my favorites are Magners and Strongbow. I got a criticism on the live stream that no local Canadian ones. I haven't found one that I really like. I haven't found it. So if you have people are listening, watching, if you have a suggestion for a good Canadian cider, let me know because I'd like to find one that I like, and I haven't found one.
Oh, that's interesting. I have a few stores here in Montreal that only sell Quebec and Canadian ciders. They're really good. I'll look them up for you. So I often do election nights now. Obviously, on election night, I'm not drinking alcohol when I'm on TV
no, of course
or radio.
Not.
Right?
No, when we're on TV.
The thing is, I love alcohol. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't have a problem, but I love alcohol. But during a show, I will drink a sugar-free energy drink in the beginning and then just water and sometimes sparkling water, but not too much because I remember once I really had to burp. And I was asked a question by the anchor, and I kept it back, and you could hear my voice changing. And as soon as they cut to another panel, I went, ugh. And so be careful with the sparkling drinks. And on live stream, you see me drink my vodka soda. My drink is vodka. I love vodka. It's so what's the word? It can go with anything, right? It's so versatile.
Ah, yes, polyvalent.
Polyvalent. So that's my drink for election nights.
That is, yes, and that is the good point. Whenever we've done anything in a more professional setting, of course, we keep it very straight edge. All right, this last one from Special K on the Discord, which I think was an interesting one. We'll finish with this one. How do you balance being poll analyst and so close to politics while remaining neutral and nonpartisan? And we appreciate this comment from this Special Case. It's because we do it so well. They've been listening to us and reading us in the Discord for a while and still have almost no idea what your views are. I'm curious what the almost is there. But anyway, how do you find that filtering difficult or frustrating? It is a challenge, I think. It is something that you have to work at and stick to. But how would you answer this one?
Well, that almost, I think, is related to the Nicodère, but okay.
Yeah, that was one of the comments. Yeah. That you have to channel all of whatever frustration you have onto one thing.
Yeah, I don't think frustration is the right word with any kadai. It's just I like
exasperation.
I want our politics to be serious. That's why. But anyway, let's not get into that today.
No.
Okay, so I asked thank you for that question and for your kind words, by the way. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Okay, a few things. The first thing I'll say is I never regretted ever not tweeting. There's never a tweet that I said, oh, I should have sent that. Usually, I've regretted some comments that I made. I look back and I was like, oh, that wasn't smart. That wasn't good. I shouldn't have done that. But I never regretted shutting my mouth. So that's a good first thing. The second thing I would say, I asked myself the same things because, of course, like everybody, like Eric, I have opinions, I have preferences, I have views on politics should. But I also met many politicians at the provincial level, at the federal level, and most of them, and I do mean most, like a huge majority of them, are really good people. They're good people. In bigger groups, there could be, I'm sorry for the language, but there could be some pricks in there. But in small numbers, when you meet with those people, you realize most of them are good and want to do the best they can and want to reach out to voters. And so I think it's much easier to go past your partisan agenda when you realize they're just humans that are trying to do their best. I know it sounds very cheesy and wholesome as an answer, but it really changed my view when I met. I mean, I remember the 22 election in Quebec. I met every leadership and their team before the campaign began. And I was like, oh, that was really interesting, and I keep a good relationship mostly with the parties. So it's easier to be nonpartisan when you're kind of friendly with everyone.
To me, there's two. One thing is that I find it much more interesting to just be an observer than to be engaged and participating. I'm not extremely political, to be honest. I'm more interested in the history of it. I'm interested, and this is the stupidest thing. I always say it for when people say, what got me into this? Is that I like maps, and I like it. I love looking at an election map. I just find the exercise interesting. And I find that is actually the easiest way for me to try to keep away from it. Because if I do get too engaged or upset or emotional about the actual issues, it's much harder to dispassionately discuss it and look at the situation. I find it much easier if I try to maintain the perspective as an observer. Because I studied history, sometimes I try to think of it as almost that I'm looking at history as it's unfolding.
Yeah. And
so it's more about what's happening than about, what it means for me personally or anything like that. So I find that that's how that's how I'm able to, for the most part, keep some separation from it. And also something that I also try to remind myself as much as I can is that you and I both have platforms and audiences, and we really appreciate it. And you can't abuse that. No. And people 100%. Follow us because they follow us because they want our objective takes on the polls and how elections are unfolding. They don't want to hear what we think about other issues. They have people for that. Yeah. They come to us for a particular reason, and I think it would be an abuse of that kind of relationship that you build with your audience if you started to tell them how you think they should think about their own personal choices and that. So I find that is a really useful thing. And also that goes into the non-tweeting. Once in a while, you want to tweet or you want to share a comment about a different topic, an entirely different topic. And you're like, you know what? People don't really care what I think about a movie or a hockey game or anything like that. That's not what they followed me for. And I'm not going to abuse the relationship they had. So I think those two things help keep you on the right track and what we strive for, I think, because we want everybody to feel that they can watch us and trust what we're saying. And if they don't always agree with us, that's fine. But we want them not to agree with us because they just think we're wrong, not because they think we have a take, we have an agenda, we have an angle.
There's no shortage of opinion pieces and places where they just shout opinions at each other. I find these places very unconstructive and unuseful, but I was told many times if I were more controversial, I'd make far more money and I'd be much more famous. And I say, well, you know what? No, thank you. I'll go back to teaching if that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
anyway.
pineapple on pizza. Do you want to take a take? Do you want to have a view on that? Oh boy. Okay. No, we're losing
No take.
viewers as we speak. All right, so that'll be it for our mailbag episode for the summer. We really appreciate all the support. You can go to support our podcast at thenumberspod.ca. You can go to my website, therit.ca, Philip's website, 338canada.ca, or 338canada.com, different
That's
things
right.
on each of them, and see what we're doing and support the work we're doing. We really appreciate it. We're getting close to the 1-year anniversary of the launch of this podcast, so it's that's kind of exciting. And it's been fun for the last little while. Looking forward to having a break and chatting again with you, Philippe. And it's going to be a busy fall, busy year and a half for us, so I can't wait.
Eric, have a great vacation. Enjoy yourself. People, stay safe out there. Put sunscreen. Be reasonable in what you do and be nice to each other. Have a great week and take care. Thank you.